If we don't secure our supply of rare earth metals soon, the technology you rely on every day could grind to a halt. Not because of a cyber attack or a market crash, but because of 17 obscure elements sitting near the bottom of the periodic table, elements most people couldn't name, and almost no one thinks about until they're gone. We are talking about neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, lanthanum, names that sound like science fiction but are embedded in the most ordinary objects around you. The magnet in your earbuds, the motor in your electric car, the targeting system in a modern fighter jet. None of these things work without rare earth metals, and the supply of those metals is controlled overwhelmingly by a single country. To understand how we arrived at this situation, you have to go back to a decision that seemed perfectly rational at the time. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Western nations gradually wound down their rare earth mining operations. The ore was cheaper to extract in China, environmental regulations were stricter in Europe and North America, and the profit margins on processing the raw material were razor-thin. So the work moved east, quietly, without anyone signing a treaty or making a speech about it. By 2010, China was producing roughly 97% of the world's rare earth supply. That figure is not a typo. The United States, which had once mined more rare earths than anyone else on Earth, had effectively zero domestic processing capacity. Europe had less. The entire global tech industry had quietly built itself on a single geological and political point of failure. What makes rare earths so strategically explosive is not just where they are found, it is how absurdly difficult they are to separate and refine. The 17 elements occur together in the same ore body, tangled up with radioactive thorium and uranium. Pulling them apart requires hundreds of chemical separation stages, enormous amounts of water and acid, and years of accumulated technical expertise. You cannot simply decide to open a mine and catch up in 18 months. The knowledge and infrastructure take decades to build. China understood this long before its rivals did. Deng Xiaoping reportedly said in 1992 that while the Middle East had oil, China had rare earths. That comparison was not accidental. Oil can be found in many places. Rare earths can too. They are not actually rare in the crust of the earth, but the combination of concentrated deposits, cheap labor, and tolerance for environmental damage made China's position nearly unassailable for 30 years. The geopolitical stakes became impossible to ignore in 2010 when a Chinese fishing vessel collided with Japanese Coast Guard ships near a disputed island chain in the East China Sea. The diplomatic fallout was sharp, and within weeks, Japanese importers noticed that their rare earth shipments from China had slowed to a trickle. Beijing never officially announced an embargo, but the message arrived clearly. Access to these materials was a lever, and China was willing to pull it. Japan responded faster than anyone. Within 5 years, Tokyo had invested heavily in rare earth recycling programs, signed supply agreements with Australia and India, and funded deep-sea mining research. It had also quietly stockpiled a strategic reserve of the most critical materials. Japan's pivot became the template that every other industrial nation would eventually try to replicate, though most started far later. The United States woke up to the problem in stages, and the awakening was uncomfortable. The Mountain Pass mine in California, once the world's largest rare earth operation, had been mothballed in 2002 after a series of radioactive wastewater spills and a collapse in prices caused by cheap Chinese competition. Restarting it required not just capital, but also rebuilding an entire processing chain that no longer existed in North America. When Mountain Pass reopened under new ownership in 2017, there was an immediate problem. The ore was being dug out of American soil, trucked across the border into Mexico, and then shipped to China for processing, because there was simply no facility in the United States capable of doing the job. The mine was American. The value was Chinese. That paradox, more than anything else, illustrated the depth of the structural dependency that had been built over 3 decades of neglect. The green energy transition has made all of this dramatically more urgent. A single offshore wind turbine uses roughly 2.5 tons of rare earth magnets. An electric vehicle motor contains about 1 kilogram of neodymium. Global demand for these materials is projected to increase by 4 to 6 times current levels by 2040, depending on how aggressively countries pursue their climate targets. The supply chain that was already tight is now expected to carry a weight it was never designed for. Several countries are now racing to develop what governments are calling critical mineral strategies. The United States passed legislation channeling billions of dollars toward domestic mining and processing. The European Union published a Critical Raw Materials Act designed to ensure that no single foreign country supplies more than 65% of any strategic mineral. Australia, Canada, and several African nations are negotiating supply agreements with the specific goal of building an alternative ecosystem to China's. But building that alternative ecosystem means confronting some deeply uncomfortable contradictions. Mining rare earths is extraordinarily damaging to local environments, to water tables, to soil, to the communities living near extraction sites. The same green energy revolution that needs rare earths to function is, in part, powered by an industry that leaves toxic tailings ponds and stripped landscapes in its wake. Western democracies are discovering that they cannot have clean energy without at least some dirty mining, and their populations are not always prepared for that trade-off. There are also promising technological paths that could reduce the pressure. Researchers in Japan, Europe, and the United States are developing rare earth-free permanent magnets using iron and nitrogen compounds, or manganese and bismuth alloys. Urban mining, recovering rare earths from discarded electronics, is advancing quickly enough that some analysts now treat the world's landfills as a legitimate ore body. Neither of these approaches will close the gap on its own, but together they represent a gradual loosening of the bottleneck. Meanwhile, China has not been standing still. Facing its own rising domestic demand, Beijing has been consolidating its rare earth industry into a handful of state-controlled giants, reducing export quotas, and investing in moving up the value chain, not just selling raw oxides, but manufacturing the finished magnets, the motors, the components that go into the devices the rest of the world buys. If that shift completes, the leverage China holds will not merely be over raw materials. It will be over the assembled products themselves. The global fight over rare earth metals is not a distant policy argument happening in trade ministries. It is the reason certain components are backordered for months. It is the reason defense contractors are auditing their supply chains. It is the reason a mine in a remote Australian desert or a processing plant in rural Texas is suddenly a matter of national security. These 17 elements will not stay hidden in the fine print much longer. The nations that understand their importance earliest will hold extraordinary leverage over the ones that figure it out too late.
If you found this deep dive valuable, hit the like button, drop a comment below on what tech mystery we should decode next, and subscribe to never miss an episode.